Asymmetrical Multiplayer. A multiplayer game in which some players have different roles, abilities, or playstyles than other players. This usually manifests itself in having two teams. One team has more players with weaker individuals, and one team has less players with stronger individuals. Asymmetric multiplayer games are a fairly niche genre with a ton of untapped potential. There's tons of awesome games that do this sort of thing, but most of those sorts of games either lack tons of replay value, or the developers went for a long-term game plan, but the games just died. Most multiplayer games are symmetrical multiplayer games, where both teams have access to all of the same characters, abilities, guns, whatever. You have the option to play as the same character or use the same loadout as your opponent, therefore, the game is symmetrical. But symmetrical games make up most games, so let's look at some examples of asymmetrical games. The most popular asymmetrical game, by a long shot, is Dead by Daylight. Dead by Daylight is an extremely interesting game. On one team, you have 4 survivors. They have pretty much no offensive capabilities whatsoever. The other team is just one player, the killer. The survivor's goal is to charge these generators and escape through one of 2 exit gates. The killer's goal is to sacrifice the survivors to the entity in the sky by hanging them on these hooks. Hooking the same survivor 3 times fully sacrifices them out of the game. This game has tons of depth that you wouldn't realise that it had just from watching gameplay of it. The survivors, when coordinated well, can demolish all of their objectives so fast that the killer can't realistically catch anybody. But a good killer who uses their power well and has good game sense can make it almost impossible for a survivor to sit on a generator for very long at all. Each killer has a unique ability that gives them strengths and weaknesses over other killers. Survivors are all very similar to each other, but they have unique perks. Some survivor perks are completely bonkers, and some are completely useless. Some killers, to put it bluntly, have way too many strengths and not enough weaknesses, and some killers have too many weaknesses for not enough strengths. And the killers have perks too, which brings all of the same balance problems as the survivor perks. It might sound like I'm bashing the game, but I'm not. The game is not perfectly balanced, but given how hard it is to balance asymmetrical games, they're doing a really good job, and future balance patches and reworks could easily make this game even more well balanced than it already is. So what else we got? Evolve, that's a big one. Everyone was so hyped for this game, and it looked really cool. Tons of depth, interesting concept, really cool visual style and theme. Dead. Pretty rapidly as well, it died very fast. There was 4 hunters versus 1 monster. The monster's goal was to kill the 4 hunters, and the hunter's goal was to kill the monster. The death of this game, honestly, is pretty surprising to me, since I never actually played it myself, so I never got to see what its flaws were. Maybe it was poorly balanced, maybe it was developer oversights. Doing a bit of research apparently tells me that the game was paid DLC hell, but I don't have any first-hand experience, so don't take my word for it. There's some pretty cool out-of-the-box examples of this sort of game as well. Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes is a cooperative, asymmetrical multiplayer game. One player can see the bomb and the puzzles on it, the other player can't see the bomb, but they have all of the solutions to the puzzles and how to defuse them on their papers. So one player has to tell the other how to defuse the bomb. This game is quite a lot of fun, but just from the premise alone, this isn't the sort of game that can realistically have any longevity, no matter how good the game is. Once you've done a bunch of the puzzles, you've seen everything that the game has to offer you. That and the fact that it's so unique as a game means that it can't really be seen as a competitor to the other games that we're going to mention. What else have we got? Dungeon Land. I remember when this came out. It was a really cool premise with a completely abysmal execution. 3 players play as heroes in a dungeon crawler style game, and 1 player plays as the Dungeon Master, summoning monsters and traps to try and defeat your opponents. A really cool premise that was so extraordinarily buggy and poorly balanced on release that it died really quickly. Nobody wants to play a game that's barely functional on release, so nobody played it. The most galaxy brain example of an asymmetric game that I could think of was versus Saxton Hale. This game mode is awesome. It's a Team Fortress 2 community-made game mode. On one team, you have anywhere between 2 and 23 players. They can play as any of the 9 classes TF2 has to offer. On the other team, you have
Saxton Hale here. Yep, another one escaped. Yeah, I killed it. Nah, this time it exploded.
Saxton Hale has a melee attack that instantly kills anybody it hits. He has a super jump to catch people hiding on roofs, he has a stun mechanic to stun nearby enemies, and he has thousands and thousands of health. The more enemy players, the more health he has. I've never seen anyone mention this game mode when it comes to asymmetric multiplayer, but it's a genius example of it. It's extremely simple, yet has tons of replay value and depth because of how differently all of the 9 classes interact with Saxton. Honestly, this might be the second most popular asymmetrical game on this list next to Dead by Daylight, and it's not even a standalone game. That's pretty depressing, isn't it? The Aliens vs Predator game from 2010 had an asymmetrical multiplayer game mode called Species Deathmatch. You had 3 teams: Aliens, Predators, and Marines. The number of players per team can vary, but the Marines get way more player slots than the other 2 teams do, as they are individually the weakest characters. This game mode was hideously poorly balanced. In a coordinated team, the Marines were completely unkillable, but without high coordination, Predators just jumped around murdering everything. Surprisingly though, this game apparently still has quite a decent player count on PC. Console versions though, not so much. Doom Eternal's multiplayer looks extremely promising, and it's the most recent article on our list. In Doom 2016, people complained that the multiplayer felt nothing like the main game, where you were just sort of playing a basic deathmatch game that didn't represent Doom as a franchise. In single player, you're running around like a one-man army slaying the entire depths of hell, but in multiplayer, it's slowed down considerably, and you're just shooting other Doomslayers with the occasional demon thrown in. So in Doom Eternal, they brought out the big guns. Asymmetrical multiplayer, 2 demons, 1 Doomslayer. The demon can summon little minion grunts to chase around the Doomslayer. The Doomslayer has all of the same abilities he has in single player. He's highly mobile and does insane amounts of damage. This game again suffers from something that lots of asymmetrical multiplayer games also suffer from. The team with more players being highly coordinated is a much different game than that team being a bunch of uncoordinated randoms. The survivors not coordinating in Dead by Daylight makes the game extremely killer favoured, and there's no guarantee that your survivor teammates are going to coordinate with you if you queue on your own. But if they do coordinate, and coordinate well, the killer can feel unable to do anything. This also exists in Doom Eternal's multiplayer. Highly coordinated demon players will absolutely murder you before you can do anything. They won't give you any room to breathe whatsoever. But if they're not so coordinated, you don't really feel under much pressure at all. The last example is probably the one that a lot of you who are in the know have been waiting for me to mention the entire time. Friday the 13th. This is a very similar premise to Dead by Daylight. 6 survivors try to escape from Jason Voorhees. Both teams have a ton of tools at their disposal to either escape the killer or to murder everyone, depending on which side you're on. However, the copyright of Jason Voorhees and the Friday the 13th movies has been heavily disputed between the director of the original movie and the writer of the original movie. There's been a very long legal case that began in 2017 that put not only the movies featuring Jason out of action, but the Friday the 13th game as well. Friday the 13th has not seen any updates for over 2 years now, and it's all down to a legal dispute. This game would have reasonably been Dead by Daylight's only competition in the market. It had all that same depth, all of the cool horror aesthetic, but unfortunately, a petty legal disagreement has sent the game into development limbo with no sign of it ever returning. And without it, Dead by Daylight is the king that will seemingly never be dethroned. Dead by Daylight is one of the very few asymmetrical multiplayer games that isn't either a fun gimmick with no replay value, or completely dead on arrival face down in the water. There's some promising alternatives, but most of them are quite new, and seeing how much staying power they're going to have so early on is really difficult to do. There's also bound to be countless games I haven't heard of or just didn't mention for the sake of time, but do make sure to tell me about them in the comments. Also, something like and subscribe, I don't know. For a genre with such a diverse range of interesting and unique games, the risk of making something quirky and out of the box is clearly not a risk that too many developers want to take, and because of it, there are very few asymmetrical multiplayer games with any staying power whatsoever. But hopefully, seeing Dead by Daylight's long-term success might tell developers that it's something worth looking into for future games. Thanks for watching.